At 59, Helena Bonham Carter sat beneath a soft, amber light, the kind that flatters faces but reveals truths. She had spent decades hiding behind characters who screamed, wept, and burned. But that afternoon, in a quiet interview meant to celebrate her career, she let slip a sentence that stopped time. "Johnny and I understood each other's madness," she said, her voice calm, as if speaking of the weather. It was too real to be just acting. For a moment, silence filled the room. The interviewer hesitated, unsure whether he had just heard a confession or a line from a script. But Helena smiled, that mischievous, knowing smile she wore in every Tim Burton film, and changed the subject. The words, however, lingered like smoke. What did she mean by too real? For nearly 20 years, Helena Bonham Carter and Johnny Depp had lived inside Tim Burton's gothic world's lovers, killers, monsters, dreamers. On screen, their connection felt electric, unexplainable, a pulse between two souls who seemed to share the same darkness. Off-screen, rumors followed them like shadows, that they spoke their own secret language, that Helena's home was filled with Johnny sketches, that they didn't need words to understand each other. They denied it all. They laughed it off. But the chemistry remained raw, unpredictable, almost sacred. When Helena finally spoke those words, too real to be just acting, it was as though she had opened a door no one was meant to see behind. She was no longer the mad queen of Burton's universe, and he was no longer the cursed poet with scissor hands. They were two people who had found something real in a world built on illusion. Perhaps it wasn't romance. Perhaps it was recognition, the quiet relief of finding someone who mirrored your chaos. In the surreal carnival of Tim Burton's imagination, where love often looked like madness and beauty was found in the grotesque, Helena and Johnny were not merely co-stars. They were reflections of each other's fractures, partners in a kind of emotional exile. And maybe, just maybe, in the chaos they created together, they found the only kind of peace that ever made sense. In the early 2000s, the worlds of Tim Burton began to bloom into their most intoxicating form. Dark fairy tales woven from loneliness, eccentricity, and longing. At the heart of those worlds were two faces, Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter. Together, they were not merely actors. They were extensions of Burton's subconscious, surreal, tragic, and achingly human. The public saw them as part of a mythic trio, Burton the visionary, Depp the eternal outsider, and Helena the unpredictable muse. Each new film, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Sweeney Todd, Corpse Bride, Alice in Wonderland, seemed to deepen their shared spell. Every glance between them, every whispered exchange, carried a strange, magnetic charge. To watch them was to witness chemistry that refused to be contained by the screen. Helena's pale fragility and Johnny's haunted stillness created an emotional gravity that pulled viewers into their orbit. They were both, in their own ways, beautiful distortions, as if they had crawled out from the same fever dream. Reporters asked how they sustained such intensity. Both always gave the same playful answer: "We're just acting." But something in the way Helena laughed afterward, or the way Johnny's eyes lingered on her before he looked away, suggested that wasn't the whole truth. Behind the cameras, their rhythm was uncanny. They finished each other's sentences. They improvised scenes in ways that felt telepathic. Tim Burton, often directing the two simultaneously, once said, half jokingly, "They don't need me. They live in their own world." That world wasn't built from glamour. It was chaos, art, and mutual recognition. Helena and Johnny were not Hollywood's golden pair, they were its mirror image. The shadows behind the shine. Both had known heartbreak. Both had endured judgment for being too strange. Both had learned to turn pain into performance. When Sweeney Todd was released in 2007, critics praised their dark harmony. She, as Mrs. Lovett, the lonely pie maker yearning for the murderer she adored, he, as Sweeney, the man consumed by vengeance. Together, they sang of blood and loss with such conviction that it felt like an emotional duet between real souls, not characters. In interviews, Helena often downplayed the intensity. "It's all fiction," she'd insist, smiling that wicked smile. Yet, when asked how she and Johnny maintained trust in such emotional scenes, her tone shifted. "Because he's safe," she said softly. "He understands the chaos." It was a simple sentence, but within it lay something profound, the acknowledgement of shared fragility. Johnny, beneath his layers of costume and eyeliner, was not the reckless rebel tabloids adored. He was delicate, almost shy. Helena, beneath her eccentric dresses and disheveled hair, was not the madwoman she portrayed. She was observant, maternal, fiercely loyal. In each other, they found permission to exist without explanation. Hollywood, of course, adored their strangeness. The red carpets became Theater Helena in mismatched shoes and layered Victorian lace. Johnny in his unkempt scarves and weathered hat. They stood slightly apart, often laughing at jokes no one else seemed to understand. To the public, they looked like two misfits who had escaped from the same asylum. But to those who watched more closely, there was tenderness in their oddity. Tim Burton's films became a reflection of this bond. In Alice in Wonderland, Johnny's Mad Hatter looked at Helena's Red Queen with something deeper than fear, almost compassion. The line between fantasy and truth blurred, not because they confused the two, but because both worlds required the same honesty. By then, Helena was living with Burton, and Johnny was in a long-term relationship with Vanessa Paradis. To the outside world, everything looked neatly compartmentalized. Two brilliant actors, two families, a shared creative universe. But on set, there was a quiet current no one could name. Some called it artistic intimacy. Others whispered that it was love disguised as performance. Helena, ever the realist, would later laugh at such speculation. "People always need to make things simpler than they are," she said. But the truth is, some relationships can't be labeled. They just are. Perhaps that was the essence of the illusion, not what they hid, but what they could never define. Their connection was built not on physicality, but on resonance. When Johnny walked into a room, Helena didn't need to look up to feel his energy. When she spoke, he listened as if her voice came from somewhere familiar, an echo from his own mind. And maybe that was what made their partnership so magnetic. It wasn't about romance or desire. It was about survival. In a world that misunderstood them, they became each other's translator. But behind the curtain of collaboration, something fragile began to form a dependence that neither dared to name. When Tim Burton and Helena's real-life relationship began to falter, Johnny became a quiet constant. And when Johnny's fame turned to infamy, Helena was one of the few who didn't turn away. Still, they remained careful. No declarations. No boundaries crossed, only the shared understanding that some bonds are too sacred to explain. Yet, for all their discretion, their eyes betrayed them. On screen, every look between them carried history, off-screen. Every silence carried weight. Their illusion was perfect, and for a long time, they needed it to be. Because illusion was safer than truth. Illusion kept the world at bay. But as with all illusions, cracks eventually appeared. And when they did, the question no one dared to ask began to whisper through Hollywood's corridors. What if their madness had always been the most honest thing about them? There is a kind of bond that begins in silence, one that grows not from touch or confession, but from the recognition of another wounded soul. Between Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter, that silence became a language. It was never loud. It never needed to be. In the years after Alice in Wonderland, life began to shift for both of them. Helena's long relationship with Tim Burton quietly fractured under the weight of time and distance. Their shared home, that strange cluster of adjoining houses in North London, became a symbol of separation disguised as togetherness. And on the other side of the ocean, Johnny's life was spiraling into a storm that would soon make headlines around the world. He was no longer the eccentric genius the press adored. He had become the villain of his own legend. Helena watched from afar with the understanding of someone who had seen the fragile, human side of him long before the world decided who he was. In interviews, she chose her words carefully. She defended his character, his kindness, the quiet man behind the mythology. People forget he's human, she said once, almost in a whisper. But those who knew her best recognized that tone protective, loyal, and slightly broken. They had met each other in a world built on masks. And what connected them was the refusal to wear one when they were together. On set, they shared more than dialogue. They shared fragments of memory, grief, exhaustion. There was no need for small talk. Their friendship, or whatever it was, existed in a sacred space between confession and art. Helena often said that acting with Johnny was dangerous because he didn't pretend. He brought his entire soul into every scene, the pain, the love, the confusion. And she met him there, unafraid to look at the shadows most people avoid. Together, they created characters that were tragic but tender, monstrous yet human. In doing so, they revealed themselves. When Sweeney Todd ended filming, Helena wrote him a note. No one ever saw it. But years later, she hinted at its content. It was about gratitude, she said, and about how rare it is to find someone who makes you feel less alone in your strangeness. She never said love. But perhaps that was the point. Theirs was not a love story in the conventional sense. It was a story about recognition, two people who saw through each other's performance and found comfort in the chaos. There were moments when she wondered what it might have been like if timing had been different, if both of them hadn't been tethered to other worlds, other obligations. But then she'd laugh it off, knowing that their connection thrived precisely because it couldn't become something else. Boundaries kept it pure. The unspoken kept it alive. When Johnny fell deeper into public scrutiny, Helena's loyalty never wavered. She spoke less in interviews, perhaps out of fatigue, or perhaps because she understood that words could not save someone whose life had turned into a spectacle. Instead, she sent quiet messages, postcards, small gifts, reminders that friendship can be an anchor when the ocean turns violent. Johnny, in turn, would occasionally mention her in passing, always with affection, always with the same wistful tone. "Helena's one of the few people who knows how my brain works," he said once. "She's seen the madness and didn't run away." In a business built on pretense, such words carried weight. There were no romantic declarations, no grand gestures. But if you look closely at photographs from those years behind the premieres, the red carpets, The interviews, you see something quiet and enduring. The way Helena's eyes softened when Johnny spoke. The way his posture relaxed in her presence. They existed as a small rebellion against a world that demanded simplicity. When their connection was anything but. Art became their refuge. Every new project, every shared frame, allowed them to speak without saying a word. They didn't need to explain their bond to anyone. In fact, explaining it would have ruined it. Helena once described acting as borrowing someone else's skin to tell your own truth. With Johnny, she didn't have to borrow. Their shared strangeness, their love for imperfection, and their fascination with pain made their work almost spiritual. Both had been misfits since childhood. She, the daughter of aristocracy who never fit its mold. He, the boy from Kentucky who ran from everything ordinary. They found beauty in brokenness and, perhaps, saw in each other what they couldn't see in themselves, the possibility of being understood without being fixed. There's an old saying that artists bleed quietly. For Johnny and Helena, that bleeding became performance every glance, every trembling breath on camera, an echo of a truth they couldn't name. In dark shadows, they reunited again. Years after Sweeney Todd, the magic was still there, but it felt heavier, more mature, as if they both knew how fragile the bond had become. Between takes, they talked about aging, about family, about finding peace in chaos. Johnny joked about being a shadow who can't stop falling in love with ghosts. Helena didn't answer, she simply smiled. A smile that said she understood. When Burton eventually drifted into his own world, both of them seemed to lose a piece of their shared home. Without his cinematic universe to orbit around, they became two planets floating through separate darknesses, occasionally brushing past each other's light. Yet the connection never died. It transformed from creative partnership into quiet guardianship. Two outsiders. It might have looked like nostalgia, but to them, it was survival. Because in a world that demands clarity, some relationships exist to remind us that love doesn't always seek definition. Sometimes, it's enough to know that someone once looked at you and saw everything and didn't flinch. Helena once said, "Johnny lives in a place that most people are afraid to visit, the part of themselves that feels too much." Perhaps that's why she was never afraid of him. She had lived there too. And so, their connection endured invisible, indestructible, undefined. She would go on to new roles, new lives. He would rebuild his name, piece by piece. But somewhere, in the quiet rooms of their separate worlds, a photograph, a note, or a memory would catch their eyes, and they'd remember what it felt like to be truly seen. Not as stars, not as myths, but as two strange souls who, for a moment in time, recognized the same madness and called it peace. The truth, when it finally revealed itself, did not arrive with fireworks or tears. It came quietly, as most truths do, in the form of time. Years passed, and both Helena Bonham Carter and Johnny Depp drifted into new phases of their lives. Yet, somehow, the thread that had once tied them together never quite loosened. It simply grew invisible. And when Helena spoke again about Johnny years after the trials, the headlines, the storms her words carried the stillness of someone who had seen the heart of a man the world had already judged. "He's one of the kindest and most misunderstood people I know," she said in 2022, long after most had turned their backs on him. You can't spend years creating art with someone and not know their soul. It was not a defense, it was a revelation. A truth disguised as loyalty. For decades, the public had assumed that their connection was merely professional, two actors cast repeatedly by the same director. But Helena's tone suggested something deeper, that their bond had survived fame, scandal, and silence because it had been born in something more enduring than love understanding. That understanding, however, came at a cost. During Burton's separation from Helena, the mythology surrounding their trio shattered. What once looked like a gothic family of creative misfits, Burton, Depp, and Helena turned into fragments of separate lives. The collaboration that had defined an era ended without ceremony. No dramatic breakup. No feud, just distance. Like the slow fade of a film's final shot. But in that fading light, something remarkable remained. Johnny still sent gifts for Helena's children. Helena still kept photos from Sweeney Todd in her study. They were not memories of a working partnership. They were relics of a shared existence that blurred the boundary between fiction and truth. When Helena described their time together, she used a peculiar phrase, an artistic marriage without the chaos of romance. It was her way of explaining the unexplainable, that some relationships can be more intimate than love, and more lasting than desire. For Johnny, who had spent a lifetime being misunderstood by fame, by tabloids, by lovers, Helena was one of the few who saw beyond the myth. She didn't try to fix him or worship him. She simply witnessed him. And that, for a man built on illusion, was the purest form of affection. It was also the most dangerous. Because being seen too clearly means there's nowhere left to hide. On film sets, that visibility became art. Helena could look at him and know when he was bleeding inside. Johnny could hear her voice and sense when she was performing through pain. Their characters, the Mad Hatter and the Red Queen, Sweeney, Todd, and Mrs. Lovett became metaphors for the selves they never dared to expose elsewhere. Audiences thought they were acting, but what they were watching was catharsis, two people quietly exorcising the ghosts that haunted them. And so, the biggest revelation was not about a secret affair or hidden letters. It was this, that their madness, the thing that had always set them apart, was their truth. In an industry obsessed with control and image, they had the courage to remain chaotic. Their connection was not tidy, not public, not even fully explainable, but it was real. It existed in the margins, in the way Helena would glance at Johnny and say, "Are you still surviving the circus?" And the way he'd smile, exhausted but grateful, and answer, "Barely." That was their truth. That was the love they never named. And perhaps that's why Helena's confession, years later, carried such quiet power. It was too real to be just acting. It wasn't an admission of romance. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes the heart doesn't follow rules. It recognizes itself in another and refuses to let go, even when the world insists on labeling, explaining, or erasing it. In the mythology of Hollywood, where relationships are as temporary as applause, Helena and Johnny's connection became something rare, not a scandal, not a secret, but a mirror. A mirror that reflected what so many of us fear to confront, that the person who understands our madness may not be meant to stay, only to remind us that we are not alone in it. And when the credits finally rolled on their shared story, there were no declarations, no dramatic goodbyes, only a strange peace, like the last frame of a Burton film haunting, tender, and unresolved, because some truths do not need closure. They just need to be felt. When all the noise faded, the films, the interviews, the speculation, what remained between Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter was something too delicate to name. It wasn't romance. And it wasn't simply friendship. It was that rare form of connection that exists beyond possession. Two souls who had recognized each other in the dark and quietly agreed to keep the light alive. In a world obsessed with clarity, they had chosen ambiguity. In a culture that demanded explanations, they offered silence. And in doing so, they preserved something that fame could not distort: authenticity. Helena once said that madness was simply a different way of seeing the world. Perhaps that is why she and Johnny understood each other so completely. They both saw beauty in brokenness, humor in tragedy, tenderness in monsters. They both lived on the edges, where imagination meets loneliness, where art becomes confession. Their story is not one of scandal or betrayal, but of recognition. Two misfits, shaped by art and pain, who found in each other a reflection of their truest selves. They did not need to belong to each other. It was enough to know they belonged to the same emotional language. There's something profoundly human in that, the idea that love doesn't always demand touch, or promises, or permanence. Sometimes, love is simply the act of seeing and being seen without fear. For Helena and Johnny, that was the real miracle. Not the roles they played, not the worlds they built on screen, but the invisible understanding that survived it all. And perhaps that is the lesson their story leaves behind, that in a universe of illusions, the rarest truth is connection. Because love, in its purest form, is not about saving or possessing. It is about witnessing someone's chaos and staying gentle. As one of Burton's characters once whispered, "We're all a little mad here." Maybe madness was never the problem. Maybe it was the proof that they were alive. And somewhere, between the light and the shadow, the Mad Queen and her shadow are still there, not together, not apart, just existing in the quiet truth they once shared.